This hearing of the Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law will come to order. We're here today to examine persistent cybersecurity concerns in the data broker industry. This is not the first time our subcommittee has gathered to do so. After a cybersecurity breach last August, we held a hearing to ask the question, how secure is consumers' data in the hands of data brokers? The answer? Well, not very secure. The data broker industry immediately responded by committing to take seriously security issues and pledging to dedicate resources toward data protection measures. Yet here we are, 2 years later, in the wake of what we now know is the largest breach ever of private consumer data. We're trying to figure out how it happened once again. It happened because data brokers have created an industry-wide culture that appears not to prioritize the security of consumers' information. Traditional data brokers, those who make a profit from buying and selling data to other companies, have very little direct interaction with consumers. They have very little incentive to earn or maintain consumers' trust. So, resources are invested in increasing profits, and security is apparently treated as an expenditure that ought to be minimized. This, of course, is unacceptable. Today, this subcommittee continues its efforts to monitor the data broker industry by asking another question. How do data brokers prioritize the security of consumers' data? We have now seen over and over how easy it is for hackers to breach data broker systems due to a lack of proper security. Last month, Equifax announced that hackers breached its internal databases and stole unprecedented amounts of consumer information. Hackers were able to access Equifax's database through a software vulnerability that Equifax failed to resolve despite having been alerted to the vulnerability and its potential for criminal exploitation by DHS. The hackers continuously attacked Equifax's systems undetected for a period of over 4 months. By the time Equifax took any steps to stop the attacks, 145.5 million Americans' personal identifying information had been stolen, including the data of nearly 3 million Arizonans. We will now further ask, what did Equifax do to prioritize the security of consumer data? We will hear today from Rick Smith, former chairman and CEO of Equifax. I will let Mr. Smith describe the remaining details of the breach in his testimony. These details are important. We must examine them if we're going to learn from this incident. I'm also pleased to welcome to the committee Jamie Winterton from Arizona State University and Tyler Moore from the University of Tulsa, who will be on the second panel. It's my hope that this hearing will finally provide answers to the subcommittee questions regarding industry-wide security practices and identifying ways in which data brokers can truly prioritize the security of sensitive consumer data. Now, Senator Franken, if you'll give your opening statement, we'll go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's very important hearing. You and I were here together just 2 years ago discussing the security risks associated with vast databases of consumer information like those compiled by data brokers like Equifax. We spoke of such companies as being the perfect target for cyber criminals, and we discussed the lack of accountability that data brokers have to the Americans whose very sensitive information they collect, analyze, and share on a massive scale. We also talked about the worst-case scenario, what happens when there is an unprecedented breach of a company that trades on the information of people with whom they have no direct relationship or no particular set of obligations. Well, unfortunately, we all know that we're here today, again, because that worst-case scenario is our new reality. Because of the gross failures of Equifax, as well as a lack of safeguards protecting our privacy and security, 145 million Americans, including over 2 million Minnesotans, are facing the risk of identity theft for the rest of their lives, from tax fraud and medical identity theft to even driver's license theft, the threats of individuals' financial security, and frankly, of their livelihoods are too numerous to count and will persist for decades. To make matters worse, the Americans who could be hit the hardest are the ones who may be least able to bear such a burden. According to a Department of Justice survey, the average victim of identity theft loses $1,343 in stolen assets and expenses. That's money out of Americans' pockets for Equifax's failures. And it's a significant burden for most Americans. And let's not forget or downplay what this breach means for our national security. Whether a foreign power was actually behind the cyber attack on Equifax, there's no longer any doubt that a hostile foreign government could use the exposed information to target Americans for blackmail or influence future elections. Mr. Smith, I know you're about to tell us how sorry you are, and I'm sure that you've had a lot of sleepless nights in recent months, but as a business that has consistently operated with little or no regard for the well-being of American consumers, I'm wondering whether you and the rest of Equifax's leadership foresaw the gravity of a breach and failed to take the proper precautions because you simply don't care, and because you don't have to care. Equifax won't be losing any business as a result of its failures. American consumers are not able to walk away and take their business or their personal information elsewhere. And that's because those consumers aren't actually your customers. They are your product. And you've been treating them as such for years. Perhaps that's why in February of this year, the CFPB reported that the three big credit bureaus were ranked numbers 2, 3, and 4 in the agency's consumer complaint database, trailing behind only Wells Fargo. According to a 2012 FTC report, 1 in 5 credit reports contains an error. But for years, consumers have struggled to meaningfully correct that information. And just this year, Equifax settled with the CFPB for ripping off consumers over its website, claiming to, quote, offer, quote, free credit scores, when in actuality they were signing up for a $16 a month subscription service. Mr. Smith, your disregard for your customers was particularly evident in the first days following the disclosure of the breach, when Equifax attempted to force harmed individuals into arbitration and insisted on charging consumers to freeze their credit. Practices that were changed only after massive public outcry. So today's hearing is an opportunity to get to the bottom of what Equifax didn't do that it should have done, but also to think carefully about the future of data brokers and the credit reporting industry more broadly. Can data brokers with massive troves of data ever fully guarantee the security of that data? And if not, should such entities even exist? And if they must, how do we secure both transparency and accountability from the companies that trade on the most intimate details of our lives? I look forward to the testimony of our three witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Franken. Senator Franken, before swearing in the witness, we'll turn to Chairman Grassley for his
Thank you.
statement.
For the audience, I don't normally attend all the subcommittee meetings. I have great confidence in our chairman and ranking members, but this is such an important one. I wanted to be here to say a few words, and then I have to go back to the budget committee meeting. Chairman Flake, I know this isn't an unfamiliar subject to you. In the fact, in the last Congress, you held a hearing in this subcommittee examining the data broker industry's security standards for protecting personal information. I appreciate your hard work and the bipartisan approach that you and Senator Franken have taken in examining this issue over a long period of time. Today's hearing continues this committee's long-standing history of involving our committee in data breach and data security. We've held hearings to examine past data breaches and spent years working on legislation to establish a uniform national data security and breach notification standard. While our progress in Congress has been slow, criminal hackers continue to find ways to break into even the most secure systems, so they seem to be or it's hard for Congress to keep up with them. Unfortunately, data breaches and cyber attacks are going to happen. It's a matter of when, not if. Most Iowans I hear from recognize this fact, but recognizing reality doesn't mean that we must accept it and give up. We all must work to prevent future attacks and limit the harm from those that do occur. Additionally, we must appreciate the fact that not all data breaches are the same. The information and risk of harm can greatly vary from one breach to another. For example, the past breaches at Target and Neiman Marcus, which this committee held a hearing to examine, involved financial information such as credit and debit cards. Of course, this is information that absolutely must be protected and secured. If it falls in the wrong hands, it can create a lot of problems for individuals. But in the Equifax data breach, I think that's different. It's important that consumers and policymakers recognize this distinction because the threat landscape has changed. The information hackers obtained or gained access to in the Equifax breach is the most sensitive personal information used by thieves to commit identity theft. So we should let that sink in very definitely. A credit card number or a bank account information can be changed with a phone call, but you can't change your Social Security number and your date of birth. Anyone who's ever applied for a loan, a credit card, a job, or opened a bank account knows you have to provide a Social Security number, date of birth to verify your identity. Thus, if someone has this information, they can do the same and take over your identity. They can become you, and you won't know it happened until it's too late. Granted, it may be months or even years before a consumer suffers identity theft, if at all, as a result of the Equifax breach. Yet, no one will be able to prove their identity was stolen due to this particular breach. We live in a world of data breaches, so good luck locating your identity's theft's source. The status quo has changed with respect to protecting individuals from identity theft. Most Americans are clearly now at risk of real harm and not mere nuisance. What can and should we do? It's long past time for a uniform national data security and breach notification standard. I've been working with Senator Feinstein and a bipartisan group of senators on this issue. I remain committed to getting a good bill put together and over the finish line, but that's just one step. This breach should be a wake-up call to the new identity theft threat landscape that we now face. All of us, policymakers, business, and consumers, must start thinking differently than we have in the past. We need to look at ways to empower consumers to limit or prevent identity theft from occurring in the first place. One tool that's been found to be effective is credit freezes, but credit freezes are costly and can be difficult for consumers to control. In the age of smartphones and other devices where consumers can turn things on and off with the tap of a button, this shouldn't be the case. I look forward to learning more about the tools available to help consumers and the security threats faced by industry and consumers in light of this breach. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you again for holding this hearing. I encourage all of us to figure out ways to work together to strengthen the ability of consumers to protect and control access to their credit information and identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, will you stand to be sworn in? Do you affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Mr. Rick Smith is the former chairman and CEO of Equifax. Now, before joining Equifax, Mr. Smith spent 22 years at General Electric and in top positions in the company's insurance, leasing, and asset management departments. Your testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. I ask that you'd summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less. Please proceed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman Flake, Ranking Member Franken, and the honorable members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. As the chairman had mentioned, my name is Rick Smith, and for the past 12 years, I've had the honor to be the chairman and CEO of Equifax. I've submitted written testimony earlier, which goes into much greater detail than I will today, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. As you might guess, over the past month or so, I've talked to many consumers and read their letters, and I understand how frustrated and fearful many Americans are about the breach that happened at Equifax. This is my third hearing in 2 days, and in each of these hearings, I have said that there's no doubt that this criminal attack happened on my watch, and the responsibility as the CEO of the company stops with me, and I take full responsibility for letting that breach occur. I want to say to every person here in this room and every American that I am truly sorry for the breach that occurred at Equifax, and everyone at Equifax is deeply committed to making things right. Americans have the right to know how this happened. I'm prepared to testify today about what I learned and what I did about the incident in my role as CEO and chairman of the board, and also I want what I've learned about the incident since being briefed by the company's investigation, which is ongoing. We now know that this criminal attack was made possible by a combination of a human error and a technological error. The human error involved a failure to apply a software patch to our dispute portal in March of 2017. The technological error involved a scanner which failed to detect the vulnerability on this particular portal, which had not been patched. Both errors have since been addressed. On July 29th and July 30th, suspicious activity was detected. We followed our security incident response protocol at that time. The team immediately shut down the portal and began our internal security investigation. On August 2nd, we hired top cybersecurity, forensic, and legal experts, and we notified the FBI. At that time, we did not know the nature or the scope of the incident. It was not until late August that we concluded that we had experienced a major breach. Over the weeks leading up to September 7th, our team continued working around the clock to prepare to make things right. We took 4 steps to protect the consumer. First was determining when and how we notify the public, relying on the advice of our experts that we needed to have a plan in place as soon as we announced. Number 2, helping consumers by developing a website, staffing up massive call centers, and offering free services to all Americans. Number 3, preparing for an increased cyber attacks, which we were advised would occur shortly after the notification of a breach. And finally, number 4, continuing to coordinate with the FBI and their criminal investigation of the hackers, and notifying other federal and state agencies at the same time. In the rollout of our remediation program, mistakes were made, for which, again, I deeply apologize. I regret the frustration that many Americans felt when our websites and our call centers were overwhelmed in the early weeks. It's no excuse, but it certainly did not help that 2 of our larger call centers were shut down for days by Hurricane Irma. Since then, however, the company has dramatically increased its capacity. I can report to you today that we've handled more than 420 million visits to our websites, and wait times at our call centers have been substantially reduced. At my direction, the company offered a broad package of services to all Americans, all of them free, to help protect consumers. In addition, we developed a new service available on January 31st of 2018 that will give all consumers the power to control access to credit data by allowing them to lock and unlock their credit files when they want. This is free and it's free for life. Putting the power to control access to credit data in the hands of the American consumer is a powerful first step. We have all painfully learned data security is in fact a national security problem, and putting consumers in control of their credit data is just a first step towards a long-term solution of managing identity theft. But no single company can solve the larger problem on its own. I believe we need a public-private partnership to evaluate how to best protect Americans' personal data going forward, and I look forward to being a part of that dialogue. Chairman Flake, Ranking Member Franken, and the honorable members of the subcommittee, thank you again for inviting me to speak with you today. I'll close by saying once again how sorry I am about this breach. And on a personal note, I want to thank the many thousands of hardworking and dedicated people who've worked with me so tirelessly over the last 12 years. Equifax is, in fact, a very good company with thousands of great people. I know they'll continue to work tirelessly, as we have over the past few months, to right the wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I'll start the questioning. We'll go 5-minute rounds. The term data broker traditionally refers to a company whose main source of revenue comes from buying, selling, or storing consumer information. But this is sold to other companies. As I mentioned earlier, traditional data brokers have very little interaction with the consumer directly. Its customer is usually another business seeking specific information about a consumer for product marketing or lending purposes. In your testimony before the House yesterday, you stated that Equifax's, quote, traditional business model is with companies, not with 400 million consumers. What portion of Equifax's business is, consumer-facing?
Mr. Chairman, roughly 10% of our revenues around the world come from what we call B2C, business to consumer.
That's 10%. Then what is the main source of Equifax's revenue stream?
The vast majority of the remaining is largely doing analytics, insights, and providing solutions to banks, telecommunications companies, credit card issuers, insurance companies of the like around the world.
So if only 10% of the revenue is consumer-facing, what is the company's incentive for keeping consumer data secure when it has no meaningful interaction or limited meaningful interaction with the accountability of consumers?
We are clearly viewed as a trusted steward of that information, and losing that information violates the trust and confidence not only of the consumer, but also the companies we do business with as well.
I'd like to note that my staff and Senator Franken's staff have requested this kind of information from Equifax. Company's reply was not very responsive to the question posed in terms of revenue streams. Specifically, I'd like Equifax to provide a description of its business model and identify all distinct sources of revenue. And I intend to follow up with the company in writing for the answers to these questions. And I would expect to receive a satisfactory response. Can we expect that?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I'll reach out to the company, make sure we get you that information.
Mr. Smith, does Equifax maintain a company culture that prioritizes the security of consumers' private information?
Absolutely.
Has that always been the case?
I've been there for 12 years, Mr. Chairman, and we embarked upon a very aggressive ramp up in creating a culture, creating processes, investing in people and tools to put security top of mind. There's not a day that goes by that we're not talking to investors via 10Q, 10K, consumers and customers, our board of directors and our people, that being a trusted steward of data is vital to the mission of Equifax.
What are some examples that demonstrate Equifax's commitment to security?
Thank you. When I started 12 years ago, we had virtually no staff, no program around security. We hired consultants to come in and do a holistic strategic review, develop a roadmap for us. We've gone from that level in 2005 to roughly 225, 250 employees today dedicated towards security. We spend roughly 12% of our IT budget on security. We've created an enterprise risk management program that largely centers on all of our risks, including security.
Equifax waited 4 months after being alerted to a software vulnerability with the potential for criminal exploitation before taking any steps to stop the attacks. How does that reflect a culture that prioritizes security?
If I may walk through the timeline quickly, that might bring some clarity. It was in March 8th of 2017, Department of Homeland Security sent out notification that there's a vulnerability in open source software called Apache Struts. On March 9th, we sent out directions to the security team to patch, look for, identify, and patch that vulnerability. Unfortunately, that's where a human error occurred. An individual who is responsible for the patching process did not get that request to the right person. March 15th, we deployed scanning technology to look for the vulnerability. It did not find the vulnerability. On July 29th and July 30th, security individuals saw suspicious movement of data, shut the portal down shortly thereafter. On August 2nd, we brought in Mandiant, a cybersecurity forensic expert, King & Spalding, their global law firm, their cybersecurity arm, and started the investigation. To get to the heart of your question, Mr. Chairman, it wasn't until late August we had an indication that there was a breach of PII and of some significance. It was between then and September 7th that we worked diligently to prepare to go live.
Thank you. My time has expired. I have some other questions. Obviously, some of them may be asked by other members. If not, I'll follow up. But Senator Franken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, you just were talking about this human error. I want to be crystal clear about something. In your written testimony, you reference the, quote, sophisticated cyber criminals who have been behind the attacks on a long list of companies and agencies, including now yours. But I understand that numerous other entities were provided with the same U.S. CERT alert that Equifax was. For those entities, the vulnerability was assessed and patched, in some cases within hours and at very little cost. Mr. Smith, this was not a novel vulnerability with a novel solution. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would.
Okay. Now, yesterday you told Representative Walden that the, quote, human error was the individual who was responsible for communicating to the organization to apply the patch did not, end quote. And you just sort of said the same thing in your answer to Chairman Flake. Representative Walden asked, quote, so does that mean that the individual knew that the software was there and it needed to be patched and did not communicate that to the team that does the patching? Is that the heart of the issue here? And you confirmed that that was the case, and you just said the same thing, right?
Clarification, if I may, Senator. I am not certain that the individual who was responsible for communicating that the patch needed to be applied, that he knew the software was deployed. He was responsible for communicating to his team to look for the software. If the software existed, patch the software.
Okay, well, it's an individual. Mm-hmm. I guess my question then is, why is the security of 145 million Americans' personal information all in the hands of one guy? Why is it all up to Gus? How did you, knowing the seriousness of these, put it in the hands of one guy to screw up?
If I may, clarification. This one guy was responsible for the patching process. He had a team underneath him. He did not communicate and ensure a closed-loop process was followed. Number two, I mentioned in my oral...
That doesn't change that it's up to one guy, and that you've said that this is one human error, and the human error was one guy.
And I think, as I mentioned in my oral comments and my written comments, that was followed up by technology, where we deployed a scanner on the 15th of March that from a technology perspective was looking for vulnerabilities, and it did not find it either.
Okay. And Mr. Smith, you told the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the Senate Banking Committee that it was a, quote, mistake that the terms of use for your Trusted ID Premier product initially included a forced arbitration clause. You said that the, quote, boilerplate language was removed as soon as possible. Now, this begs a number of other questions, but I'll just stick to the one that's most obvious to me, and that Senator Van Hollen hit on this morning. If you recognize that it would be inappropriate to subject consumers who have been wronged as a result of the breach to force arbitration, why is it that you think it is appropriate to subject anyone who claims to have been wronged by your company into forced arbitration? Are you suggesting that every other consumer who may have been cheated or mistreated by Equifax is not worthy of the same access to justice as those who have been harmed by this breach?
Senator, if I may to clarify, the arbitration clause is in a series of products that we offer to consumers where consumers have options. If they don't like the arbitration clause in the products we offer for sale, they have the ability and right to go somewhere else. It was never our intent to have an arbitration clause.
This is in the terms of service that you would click on?
It's standard terms for consumer products, yes. It was never intended.
How long is that terms of service document? How many pages?
I don't know. We can get
don't
that.
know?
We can get that for you.
If I handed it to you right now, would you be able to find the what you'd have to opt out of, or actually what you'd have to read in order to say, "Oh, I get it. I can't go to court"?
Senator, the point I was trying to make is...
Would a human being be able to do that? That's my question. If I gave you now the terms, the conditions for signing on to the product that you sent to people, would they have been able to find it like in 5 minutes?
I have not studied that document, but my point was...
I think that answers the question. Which this is a common practice, which is companies like you put in these clauses that no one's going to read. But you're sending these people who are vulnerable because their information has been stolen a thing that basically says, here, use this product that will give you for free for a year to check your credit and to check whether you've been breached or not. And oh, by the way, not only can't you sue us if we screw this up, you can't sue us for the original breach.
The arbitration clause was removed within 24 hours.
Okay, but it isn't in your other products.
On the breach solution that was offered...
No, I asked you a question, and I just really would like you to answer the question.
I said, yes, it's in the products that we sell.
Thank you.
Senator Tillis.
Good afternoon, Mr. Smith. I was on the banking committee this morning. I appreciate your questions. I did have, because we've talked about the timeline, I just want to go back because I have some personal experience in correction and transport and software management, so I need to ask a little technical question here to be clear on timeline. So after you got the notice of a potential vulnerability with open source, you ordered the patch be applied, and through the miscommunication, it didn't get applied. Did you ultimately find instances of that open source that required a patch, and how long was it before the patch was actually applied? I'm just trying to figure out at what period of vulnerability there was.
Yeah, the best of my recollection was when the security individual on the 29th and 30th of July saw suspicious activity, and they shut down the portal at that time. That is when they applied the patch.
Okay, so that inaction on the part of somebody in your software management or infrastructure group that occurred back when the need for the patch was originally applied, it actually did not, you didn't cover that vulnerability for a couple of months then. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. Now I want to get back to did you call it Lock for Life? What's the name of the?
Yeah, that's why, yes, that's why I referred to it this morning.
Well, I have a question. One thing you mentioned in your opening comment, and perhaps in response to one of the questions about public-private partnership. I mean, one thing that, is it true that the three major providers in this field have roughly the same base of consumers? Is there a substantial difference in your base? I know you have analytics value added for your B2B customers, but do they roughly have similar bases of data that they're working from?
Roughly.
And so while we're talking about one business that was exposed to a vulnerability, the fact of the matter is all three of them could be exposed to a vulnerability, some of which could come through the sort of attacks that we saw with Sony and other businesses that thought that they had secure infrastructures. What's being done as an industry to maybe create a consortium, number one, even the Lock for Life strategy on an industry-wide basis? And two, what did you mean by a possible public-private partnership to try and harden access to this data?
Senator, on the first, yeah, I think there is an opportunity. It benefits the consumer. For the three of us, in this case ourselves, TransUnion and Experian, to work together to provide a seamless solution, free to consumers for life.
So it's a single app versus three Lock for Lives.
Yes, that's the thought.
Okay. What about that? What about the public-private partnership that you alluded to earlier? That goes beyond the private players you just mentioned.
Yeah, I would love a dialogue that talks about how do you protect identity in this cyber age, digital age we have today, and really have an honest debate on is the Social Security number, name and date of birth, in 2017 a secure way, a private way to protect someone's ID, or is there a better solution?
Yeah, I think techniques that they're using in card and payments industry, tokenization or something else really needs to get to this industry, or you're leaving us vulnerable, particularly when the remediation efforts require you to enter in parts of your Social Security number to figure out whether or not you've been exposed to a vulnerability. Back on the Lock for Life, when I lock, let's say that we have that app, does that simply prevent my information from being disseminated to anybody inquiring about my creditworthiness, or is it also opted out of the broader analytics you do to provide services to your B2B customers?
If I can clarify, it's an interesting question. If you lock your file, it prevents identity fraud against you as an individual. If you go to get a job nowadays, you have to have access to your credit report. If you want to rent an apartment, you have to have access to your credit report. You get a credit card, auto loan, mortgage, home equity. It prevents fraudulent activity against your credit from occurring. So it is a secure way to prevent identity theft.
Okay. And then I guess the final question, Mr. Chair, I'm glad that you held this committee meeting. I'm probably more glad than Mr. Sloan, but Mr. Sloan, thank you for being here. But I want to say here what I said in the banking committee meeting that's incredibly important. We could spend a lot of time talking about this event and the punitive measures that should be imposed on Equifax or anybody else who gets a breach. Or we could spend more time recognizing the broader vulnerability that we have and the role that the government needs to play in securing these platforms and ensuring that the consumer protection measures are in place. And I mentioned this to Mr. Sloan this morning. I hate that Equifax had this problem. I hate it for the employees. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that your problem, which is the cost of doing business, you have to secure the data to maintain your reputation, to be able to provide the products and services you do to your business customers and consumers. But at the end of the day, we have to continue to put pressure on businesses to not make the remediation that is required after a breach occurs to be the consumer's problem. And we've got to figure out how to get that right, and we need to have discussions about that so that we're having a perspective discussion that's addressing the millions of people and the hundreds of thousands of businesses that are every bit as vulnerable as an Equifax is based on the current pace of the bad actors versus the current pace of enterprises hardening their systems, up to and including, I might add, the Office of Personnel Management and government institutions who arguably have access to some of the best technology available. Thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you, Mr. Sloan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, this is, I'm glad the other committees are also looking at this. It's been extremely troublesome. It's almost your company, Mr. Smith. I want to state it as much in favor of you as I can. It showed gross negligence and total disregard of its customers and more of a regard for protecting its own people and its profits, even having a couple of your executive cash in stock once the breach had been disclosed, but before it's disclosed to the public. It's hard to think of such an arrogant disregard that people put trust in you. And also, but I think it may sound like a personal charge against you. I'll let you take it any way you want. But I think it shows something else. There's very little incentive for a company to protect their consumers unless something's gone wrong. And then it's as much, you did a 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of a reaction, which looked more like a PR effort than an effort to protect the customers. I've previously introduced legislation that would have required a comprehensive and enforceable approach to data security by requiring companies to take preventive steps to protect data, but also to quickly notify consumers when and customers in the event a breach occurs. And before it didn't advance, but I think it may now. I think you may find that Republicans and Democrats will support the bill I'm reintroducing for a new consumer privacy protection bill. It's certainly going to have the strong support of leading consumer right groups and privacy supports. And I hope it won't be considered political because Republicans and Democrats are being hurt by this ignoring of consumers. Corporations, I understand, can profit immensely from our personal information, often without even our knowledge, but they should be obligated to keep it safe once they have. I listened to what my colleagues have said. I made notes as they're going on. Senator Franken had talked about the consumer privacy. I think we all feel an individual consumer looks at a giant company like your former company, and they feel they're powerless, even though they're expected to give over all kinds of information about themselves. You discover this, no matter how you describe it. It took you 6 weeks from the date it was discovered to find and disclose the breach to consumers. Now, if we'd had that Consumer Privacy Protection Act, you would have been required to notify us immediately. But your lobbying report shows that you spent $250,000 lobbying the Congress, among other things, against the Consumer Privacy Protection Act. Do you think that maybe after all this has happened, consumers or companies like yours, like your former company, might take steps to protect not only themselves, but to protect their customers? So I just want to give you I'm trying to be as subtle as I can and letting you know how I feel. If you'd like to respond, feel free.
Thank you, Senator. I would like to respond. One, as I've stated in the prior hearings today and yesterday, we do take protecting data for our consumers and customers very seriously. It is a reputational issue. And once we lose that trust, it takes a long time to regain it, not just for the consumer, but for the companies who entrust us with their data as well. I'd like to touch on one thing, Senator, if I may. You had mentioned the insider trading of the stock sales. and your comments. Would you like me to talk about that now?
No, because you're going to be discussing in other committees, and
Okay.
I'll wait to hear that. What I would like to discuss is a possibility. You spend a lot of money lobbying against a Consumer Protection Act that might require you to notify consumers immediately of such breaches. Are you still going to fight and still spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to stop that kind of a consumer protection bill from going through?
Senator, I can tell you as a company, we do have a government relations team. In the scheme of things, it's relatively small. We're a company with expenses of well over $2 billion. I think our entire lobbying budget, which includes association fees, is $1 million or less.
I could care less what your budget is for lobbying. The fact is you oppose legislation that might require notifying consumers, might actually give consumers the ability to respond when they've been hurt. Are you going to, is Equifax going to continue to fight consumers' right to know?
One, I'm unaware of that particular lobbying effort you're referring to. I can talk to the company, but I'm unaware of that particular lobbying effort.
It was in your report that you have to file on your lobbying expenses. But my time is up, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted fair notice. I will try again to get through consumer protection legislation, among other things, to allow people a real choice and not be forced into an arbitration where the companies determine who's going to make the decision.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Smith, do consumers have the right to find out what kind of information data brokers like Equifax has on them?
Do they have the right?
You know, yes.
Uh,
Can
every,
they call Equifax up and say, what do you have on me?
every consumer has the right to a free credit report from us, from the industry, and that credit report would detail all the information that the credit file would have on them.
But that's just their credit, but you have a lot of other information on everybody besides just their credit information, do you not?
Yes, we do.
So if and my understanding is that you get all this information free. You don't pay anybody for the information you gather on 145 million people, which is more than 1 out of 3 people in our entire country.
It's a largely free, and there are exceptions, obviously, but this business, as you know, we're 118 years old. We're part of a federally regulated ecosystem that enables consumers to get access to credit. So
Yes.
that data is there, and it's used at their consent, by the way. Regardless of the type of data we have, if it's your employment data or your income data or your credit data, that data can only be accessed if you as a consumer give the consent for someone to access that.
How does one give consent
If
to your selling the information that you have on them?
So if you as a consumer go to your bank and want to get a credit card, for example, when you sign a contract with the bank for the credit card, you're allowing the bank the access to approve your credit in this particular case, to give you the best rate and the best line.
So it's not really a free choice, is it? If all of us had the option of not having specific information about us and pretty specific information, if we all could just do that and say, no, we don't want our information to be sold, that would be an easy matter. But if it's tied to the ability for that person to get credit or to do that, then that's not what I would call an arm's length kind of a free choice decision being made. So there's that. Is there a government agency or agencies who's investigating the breach of Equinox? Is it the NSA?
There are a variety of investigations going on, yes.
Can you name the agencies that are conducting these investigations?
State AGs, for example, FTC, and others.
Do you know if the NSA is?
Not to my knowledge.
And I realized that this committee had a hearing in 2015 expressing concerns about the security measures that that entities like you put in place. So after that hearing, the very thing that was the subject of that hearing in 2015 has come to pass. So after that hearing, did Equifax do something to secure its data?
I'm unaware of a hearing in 2015.
Mr. Chairman, did this committee have a hearing in 2015? That's what mine,
Specific to Equifax?
no, it had to do with data brokers. So, being a company that has been in this business for over 115 years, I would think that you were aware. But what did then Equifax do to secure its data?
As I was mentioning earlier, we have invested heavily in people, process, and technologies. We've staffed up dramatically. We bring in consultants from time to time to look at our processes, always looking for new tools.
And yet this breach occurred. So does Equifax face any fines or liability for the breach?
There are a number of lawsuits going on right now.
These lawsuits are brought by what?
Is it
Class
just
actions or by any
state AGs, class actions? Yes.
Right. So you are facing some liability issues. If we were to pass a bill that allowed individuals to opt out of a data broker from selling any information to them, that there goes your business, right?
More than that, there goes the economy.
There goes the economy.
If consumers don't...
This
if-
is different from the credit reporting portion of your business.
What piece are you referring to?
Well, don't you have a lot of other information besides their credit scores? You have Social Security information, you have date of birth, you have all kinds of information.
Yeah, that is all largely a part of the credit ecosystem, so it's part of the picture of a consumer. There's the credit information, the PII, Senator, which you referred to, is a part of that as well, employment data, income data. But it's all, the primary purpose of what we do is to aggregate data to give underwriters of risk the best insight to make a decision when a consumer wants access to credit.
So that sounds all very benign and all of that, but since we don't know who breached your systems, we don't know what use they're going to make of all this information that they have on everybody. How will you know if this information is being used in ways that people are not authorized to use the information?
Well, a couple things. One, we have offered 5 services to the consumers. One of those is a monitoring service, so we can monitor activity against that consumer as it relates to their credit file. 2, we're offering a lifetime ability for a consumer to lock his or her access to his or her credit file for life for free. And if you lock that file down, it secures your credit file for life.
Could I just ask one more question? So how many consumers of the 145 million have taken advantage of what you just described?
I don't have that exact data. We can get that, but I mentioned in my oral comments, I think it was 420 million consumer visits to our website alone in the last, whatever it's been, 3 weeks. The expectation is the take rate for these free services will be multiples higher than the typical take rate you get for a breach. As you know, there's breaches literally every week now in America, and we've got good insight to that, and this looks like it'll be multiples that size.
Oh, perhaps you can get back to us as to how many of the 145 million people have signed up.
Senator, point of clarification, we've offered this free service to all of America, not just the 145 million.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you. And I know we have a vote called, so I'm just going to go 4 minutes and turn it over to Senator Blumenthal. The reality is that we will never prevent all data breaches, Mr. Smith. I know this from my state. But what we can do is to control how we react when it happens. And we can also put things in place to make sure that we've done everything so that it doesn't happen. So I'm just looking at the response here. You guys didn't report the breach for a month. After disclosing the breach, you fell short with your response. Customers spent hours on hold. The Twitter account directed customers to the wrong website. The right website was not secure. The customers were initially charged. In your testimony, you laid out the timeline of discovering the data breach. Do you believe you dedicated enough time and resources preparing to respond, given what happened later and the outcry from the customers?
Senator, if I may go through a few of those. You mentioned a month to respond. as I had in my written testimony and the oral testimony, it wasn't until late August we actually understood that there was a breach that occurred, a significant breach that occurred. So it was a matter of number of weeks. The response, you are correct. I mentioned in my oral testimony that the response to our call centers and our website was overwhelming in the early days, early weeks. The volume was far greater than anything we've ever handled in our history of our company. The team reacted as quickly as they could to increase resources and improve the service level. The Twitter account that you mentioned, there was one customer service rep, and I think the number was 14 to 17 consumers got the wrong. He was responding to Twitter and directing consumers to go to a particular website. It's my understanding that 14 to 17 consumers got the wrong website from this individual who's no longer employed, and they shut that down very, very quickly. So the service was not optimal. We realize that. We apologize for that. It's getting better every day.
And so what do you think other companies could learn from this, not only as we look into a world where hacks are happening and how you would better prepare for responding? I know you went over in your opening the two things that went wrong, but what do you think that you would learn from this as a company and what other companies should learn? And then the second question is from the response, from what happened with the response.
Yeah, on the first...
Preventing and then the response.
On the first, the rate of change and sophistication of cyber attacks, the rate of increase of cyber attacks is unbelievable. I mentioned in one of the other hearings, it's not unusual for us to identify and block millions of attempted suspicious attacks every single year, and that's doing nothing but going up. So continue to challenge yourself to think creatively with outside influence on how you stay on the leading edge. Never take security for granted. On the response, Senator, I struggle with that one, to be honest. The volume of response from consumers for business of our type and size, which is largely a B2B company, not a business-to-consumer company, to have 420 million consumer visits in a few weeks. I'm not sure there's much more we could have done, and I mentioned in my opening comments too, Hurricane Irma took out 2 large call centers in the first few days of operation. There'll be time for reflection, and I'm not trying to short the answer. There'll be time for reflection. We need to look back and say, what could you have done better on both sides? And I'll do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Mr. Smith. You weren't the only one responsible for the system protecting against this kind of breach, were you?
No, sir, but I was ultimately responsible.
You were ultimately responsible, but you had a team of people. This wasn't simply your failure, it was an institutional failure, correct?
Yeah, I described it in my comments as a human error and a technology failure.
Well, a human error and a technology failure. How many employees are there at Equifax?
Approximately 10,000.
Who under you is responsible for security?
That person reported into the general counsel. That person is no longer with the company.
Has he been fired, or she?
There's 2 individuals a few weeks ago stepped down from the company. One is the chief security officer. The other was the chief technology officer. The third was the individual responsible for the
How many people have resigned or been fired?
So far, I've stepped down, as you know. Chief technology officer, chief security officer, and the individual in this patching environment. Was that 4 that I know of so far? And the investigation is still going on.
4 out of the total. Wouldn't you agree with me that many more than 4 are responsible here?
There's there's a detailed investigation going on.
You have been, in effect, you have become the designated apologist, or some would say the fall guy, but there are many more who should be held accountable, correct?
I go back. It ultimately stops with me, and it has. There's an independent external investigation going on right now, and if someone needs to be held accountable, I'm confident this board will make those people accountable.
you would agree with me that people have been harmed here.
If nothing else, they've been angered and frustrated.
Well, they've been angered and frustrated because their privacy has been invaded, their most private information has been, in effect, given to thieves, their security over years to come has been shattered. Whether or not they ever become victims of identity theft, correct?
I can't, Senator, I understand the question and the emotion of the question. And I do believe the combination of the 5 services we've offered for a year, combined most importantly with the ability of a consumer to lock down any access from any fraudulent activity for life, for free.
But their sense of security has been shattered. The Lockline program, by the way, is there any arbitration requirement attached to any of these programs?
Well, we talked about the initial rollout, had that early on, that first.
But don't the terms of use still require arbitration? Is there any arbitration requirement? Can you guarantee this committee that no consumer will ever be required to go to arbitration?
I cannot, sir.
Why?
Well, one, I'm no longer with the company. I can talk to the management team.
Well, that's what I mean by the designated fall guy. You know, you're here, you can't speak for the company. I'm interested in looking forward. How will consumers be protected? Will arbitration be required of them? Will they be compensated for the sense of security that has been lost? Will there be a compensation fund? Will there be insurance against that kind of loss? And I'm talking about a compensation fund that applies to them because of that loss of privacy. These kinds of questions, which you're unable to answer because you're no longer with the company, are as profound and important as any investigative effort looking back. And I recognize you're here without the authority to make these decisions, but I think someone from the company has to make them.
I understand your point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a vote, so I'm going to end my questions there. Thanks for holding this hearing.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Yeah, unfortunately, I have to go vote as well. Just before ending this portion, I'll go ahead and recess for the next panel, so I can go vote the 2 votes that we have to do right now. But just the hearing that we had 2 years ago and the thread that kind of goes between that one and this one, it was kind of reflected in the questions that I asked. With so little of the company's revenue, 10% in your view, customer facing, it seems that part of the problem we have with the data broker industry is that, frankly, there's just too little priority given to protecting consumer information when you don't face the consumer that much. When simply aggregate data, personal data, and then store it or sell it or market it to other companies, then it seems that privacy of individuals is given the shaft, and that's just from my view, and I think a lot of other people's view. Can you dispute that?
Senator, Mr. Chairman, I'll go back to where I was earlier on. Data privacy protection, regardless of it being a consumer's data or a company's data, we take both equally as seriously. The reputational impact is as significant coming from a consumer breach as it would be a corporation breach.
Thank you. This concludes this panel. Thank you for your testimony, and we'll recess before calling the next panel. Thank you. We'll go ahead, if you'll stand to be sworn in. You affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. I'll go ahead and introduce both of you together, and then we'll proceed from there. Ms. Jamie Winterton is the Director of Strategy for ASU's Global Security Initiative. Glad you're representing the state so well here. Ms. Winterton specializes in cybersecurity and defense research. Prior to joining ASU in 2014, Ms. Winterton was a scientist for Lockheed Martin, where she developed projects in electro-optical and radar processing for military and government organizations. Mr. Tyler Moore teaches cybersecurity and information assurance at the Tandy School of Computer Science at the University of Tulsa. His research focuses on economics of information security, the study of electronic crime, and the development of policy for strengthening security. Mr. Moore also oversees the Security Economics Lab at the university and serves as the director of Stop Badware, a nonprofit anti-malware organizations. Your written statements will be entered into the record. I ask you to summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less. Ms. Winterton, would you please proceed?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Flake. My name is Jamie Winterton. I'm the Director of Strategy at Arizona State University's Global Security Initiative. I'd like to thank you for convening a hearing on this critical issue and inviting me to participate. So I learned working with the Department of Defense and industry partners that it's best to just put the bottom line up front. So here it is. It is possible to be a responsible steward of personal data. That doesn't mean it's trivial or easy. That just means there are known solutions to a lot of the problems that we see. Most of these big data breaches aren't due to complex, sophisticated, never-before-seen exploits. Most of them come down to mismanagement of the basics, and often that's due to underfunded or undervalued security teams. And beyond the operational problems in cybersecurity, like adequate patching and staffing, there are bigger questions looming. Questions like, how can we build systems that are resilient to hackers, not just resistant? How do we create new methods of identity management? And how do we make security easier for everyone? None of these are easy questions, but they're all necessary if we want to break out of the data breach cycle. And we need to start addressing them now to ensure the future security of our citizens. To borrow a line from DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, we need an approach that's revolutionary, not evolutionary. If we're going to protect the sensitive data of our citizens and our country, a primary concern of this subcommittee, we can't just iterate on what we have. We'll need to start building networks in a whole new way. Not just computer networks, but networks of computers and people together. So, how do we stop data breaches? Well, security isn't a one-size-fits-all concept. The definition of security depends on the system you're trying to secure. What kind of data it contains, how long those data are stored, what value they might have to a potential adversary, and the types of attacks the system's likely to face. We call that a threat surface. The mom-and-pop shop on the corner has a different set of threats than a government organization or multinational company. For either of them, though, a good security plan should include technologies like two-factor authentication, encrypting data in transit and at rest, and a rapid responsive patch management system. Another critical piece of securing a system is to find its weaknesses before the attackers do. We all have blind spots to our own faults. The people who build computer systems are the same way. It's important to bring in experts from outside to test networks in the same way a real attacker would, without doing damage, of course, then providing their expert recommendations on how they'd fix the weaknesses they found. You can call them penetration testers, white hat hackers, or a red team. Either way, these people are indispensable in finding and fixing problems. And I want to change topics for a moment. There's been a lot of discussion in the media and hearings this week about the damage this breach has done at the individual level. And I in no way want to downplay the serious lifetime consequences that consumers will experience. But there's another concern regarding that large-scale breach, and that's at the national security level. 145 million records is almost half the population of the United States, although the Equifax breach does contain some non-US data. A data set this large would be an incredible asset to a foreign adversary. Now, we don't yet know who has the Equifax data. I think the verdict's still out on that, and a lot of forensic analysis will have to be done before we get anything close to an answer. But in addition to identity theft and credit card fraud, think of what else this data could be used for. The credit scores and financial histories of 145 million people start to paint a pretty detailed picture of our economy, potentially allowing an adversary to discover and exploit vulnerabilities in our economic systems and society. Chairman Flake, at your 2015 hearing on the Experian breach, you said, what may not be sensitive as one item may become sensitive in the aggregate. But the Equifax data as a set are potentially illuminating, but they're especially sensitive when combined with information from other large-scale breaches. I'm thinking particularly of the Office of Personnel Management breach in 2015, when over 21 million security files were exposed. The data lost in the Equifax breach, when combined with other sets of data, could make potentially dangerous roadmaps to the human vulnerabilities in our national security system. Oftentimes when we talk about cybersecurity, it comes across as really hopeless, but I'm actually an optimist, maybe a cautious optimist. And why is that? We have some brilliant people working on these problems. Corporate R&D groups, independent researchers, academics, government agencies, and think tanks. Whether it's in the nitty-gritty like malware reversal techniques or the big questions like the future of privacy, our country does have the capacity to make progress on these problems. We just need to yoke our resources together in a meaningful way. I can talk a little bit about what our country's universities can provide. We have a culture of exploration. We embrace tough challenges and have the freedom to take risks. We believe in research and discovery of public value. We appreciate our relationships. The challenges we face in cybersecurity are real. We face them together, and we're committed to creating solutions. So I'd like to thank you, Chairman, for inviting me here to participate today. This is a promising start for how we rethink privacy and security and end the age of large data breaches. I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Same thing. Good afternoon, Chairman Flake, Ranking Member. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The recent breach of 145 million American consumers' personal information is deeply troubling. It stands out even among prior high-profile breaches, not only for the number of Americans affected, but also for the data disclosed, Social Security numbers, addresses, and credit histories. I teach my students that a loss of confidentiality is so damaging because it is irreversible. Nothing can make a cybercriminal unsee stolen data. Consumers' information has been compromised now and forever. And unlike prior breaches where financial information such as credit card numbers have been compromised, it's simply not practical for 145 million Americans to be reissued new Social Security numbers, let alone change the home address on their mortgages. The most straightforward potential harm emanating from this breach is new credit account fraud, which is pernicious because people often don't find out they were victimized until they are denied credit due to fraudulently opened accounts. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. In recent years, the IRS has lost billions of dollars to criminals filing fake tax returns using only Social Security numbers, dates of birth, and addresses. Expect attempted tax filing fraud to spike in the coming years, along with healthcare and entitlement fraud. The potential harm goes far beyond frauds perpetrated by profit-motivated cybercriminals. Because the breach data includes physical addresses, victims of stalking and harassment could be tracked down by assailants who previously could not locate their target's whereabouts. Lastly, there's a national security threat if the stolen data was obtained by hostile foreign governments. For instance, by connecting the breach data from Equifax with the prior breach at OPM, foreign powers could identify federal workers who may have financial problems uncovered by their credit reports and target them for compromise. Note that many of these harms just discussed affect people and organizations well beyond Equifax. This includes not only the individuals whose data was compromised, it also includes financial institutions, healthcare organizations, the US government, and taxpayers. This is an example of a market failure called a negative externality. When third parties are harmed by the security decisions taken by others, the incentive to invest in countermeasures is weakened. This, in turn, can lead to mismanagement of risk by organizations that are responsible for protecting data confidentiality. Another lurking market failure is the information asymmetry that exists about the true extent and cost of harms. At this point, we know that Social Security numbers and credit reports have been breached. But we don't know how much new fraud has occurred or will be enabled, how many consumers' credit scores will be wrongly downgraded as a result of fraud, how much harassment takes place, or how many national secrets are compromised. Without an accurate assessment of these costs and who is affected, it's difficult to devise a rational response that encourages more secure outcomes. We should also be mindful of the indirect costs associated with this breach. If people reduce their online participation or their engagement with the financial system because of an erosion of trust, the total drag on the economy could far exceed the direct costs arising from this breach. So what should we do? Thus far, the main defense available to consumers is to freeze their credit. This is a good start, but it falls far short because the most harms we've talked about today would not be stopped by placing a freeze. In a world where bad actors know almost everyone's name, Social Security number, and address, we cannot continue with a system that controls access to credit reports based solely on information like this that has already been compromised. The process of unfreezing should be made as frictionless as possible. Eliminating or reducing fees for credit locks and unlocks is only a start. The lightest touch policy intervention would be to require that access to credit files be frozen by default. This would incentivize credit bureaus and data brokers to design more secure and usable authentication procedures. By promoting transparency about the true prevalence and cost of the realized harms from breaches, we could correct the information asymmetry. Companies should be required to disclose not only the breaches of confidential information, but also the occurrence and cost of fraud and complaints about unauthorized access. By gathering this information, firms would gain greater insight into the true costs of cyber insecurity, thereby encouraging more investment when it's needed. And policymakers would get a better sense of the true magnitude of the negative externalities at play, which can inform policy interventions if necessary. Over the longer term, we must move to a more secure way of authenticating people than Social Security numbers. Now that all this data has been disclosed, there's simply no going back. Again, we should look to the private sector to take the lead in innovating stronger identification and authentication mechanisms, but there remains a significant coordinating role for government in supporting that effort. Finally, we must also work to improve resilience to cyber attacks. Perfect security is not possible, but we can take steps to limit the damage that attacks cause and to recover more quickly and more completely from the harms. When breaches do occur, a robust response can help prevent a damaging loss of consumer confidence. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. Appreciate it. I mentioned at the end of my questioning of Mr. Smith that it seems that when you have a data broker, a big data broker, or companies like this that have very, just what, 10% of their business is consumer facing, the rest is just data stored or marketed to companies, that they seem less incentivized to actually protect consumers because they just don't face them that much. Is that a problem in your view?
Yes, I agree with you. When you asked Mr. Smith about whether or not Equifax had a culture of cybersecurity, he answered in the affirmative, but nothing seems to back that up. Whether it's the putting a whole patch management system on an individual and having a lot of that rest on that person.
The person's name is Gus, I think.
Yes, yes,
Right?
poor Gus.
Yeah,
Let's think
yeah.
of him. And whether it's about Gus or whether it's about how you take care of people and how you are considering them. I don't remember who it was on the subcommittee mentioned that the people were a product in this case and not considered customers. Ranking Member Franken, thank you. Yes. I see that as a big problem.
So I would just add one particular thing. I mean, I think it's clear that it dulls their incentive for investment over and above the externalities I talked about. I would also say that it gives me pause and concern about the proposed unlock lock feature, because if that were to be widely deployed, that's something that would need to go to consumers. And for a company who collects data on consumers but does not have direct relationships with consumers, I'm not sure how effective the verification and authentication mechanisms could be in that case.
What does, for companies that do this right, this privacy right, what does it look like? You kind of give a sketch of a company like this, like the ones we're talking about, these data brokers. What would proper security measures look like?
It comes into this culture that you mentioned. When companies build security into the design and development of their products, so they're thinking about security as they're making new products, they don't expect to just bolt it on at the end. Bolt-on security never works very well.
So some of these measures that they offered in the end after the breach.
We're a little hasty.
Right. So those should be put in place, or have more of those things in place beforehand.
Sure. Sure. Or valuing people, supporting them enough so it's not just one person that has to deal with patching or encrypting data, or there are a lot of different pieces.
On that same line, Mr. Moore, when they found, or that they should have, what should they have found when Gus failed to provide the patch? I mean, he was saying it was human failure followed by technical failure. What would proper security look like?
Well, I think what you would see is a step of sort of identification of the assets you have. If you look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, the very first step is identify, right? So an organization who has their cybersecurity house in order should be able to identify quite robustly the configuration of all of their systems, what the software configurations are, and then from there be able to react to the announcements of vulnerability disclosures very quickly to apply patches to fix the problem. So I think step one is to do a better job of identification, but it carries all the way through to whenever a breach occurs to be prepared for the response, so that you're ready in the event that an adverse event happens.
At least additional protocols should be put in place to follow on after human failure with another human check, perhaps, and are there industry standards that have been adopted or best practices that others use that should be instructive here or not?
I would start with the NIST cybersecurity framework as a guiding set of principles for how to approach the cybersecurity risks within an organization. That's where I would begin.
All right. Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed your testimony, Ms. Winterton. We had these votes, and I got stuck down there for a conversation about Puerto Rico.
It's an important thing. It's all right.
Yeah, but this is really important too. And I heard your testimony at the end there. Basically what you're saying is that no matter how much is invested in security, even if you have like two guys behind Gus, that there's no guarantee that that there isn't going to be some unforeseeable threat to databases as large as Equifax. And although this was not an unforeseeable threat, this is something they screwed up. But for both of you, for discussion's sake, how do we rethink this? I mean, how do we rethink this industry more broadly? Equifax is not terribly responsive to the people whose information was breached because they're the product, not the customer. What is the incentive we put in place for them to act more responsibly in this circumstance? And I mean, if you're saying we can't just do Social Security and date of birth and what was the other?
Address.
Address, okay. What do you do? I mean, it's time that we just put a chip in every baby that's born. And
I have a 5-month-old at home, so he might object to that. But
well, he's already born. But I mean, I'm talking about your next child.
Oh, fair enough.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think we start with a better accounting of the harms that take place. I think if you look at the cybersecurity industry writ large, we have there are breaches which occur, but there are limits to what companies have to disclose. Whenever they lose your personal information, they have to say something because 47 states now have an obligation that's put on these companies. But whenever there's actually actual identity theft, whenever there are measurable harms that affect other parties, these still can go unreported. And so I think we need a much more transparent and complete accounting of when things go wrong so that we can identify which actor should internalize the externality and and come up with a way to measure progress against events as they unfold.
If I can bounce off of that a bit, measuring progress, this is one thing we have a really hard time with in cybersecurity. There's no way to say that system is 85% secure, or even maybe a security step that we've taken, what effect does that have, and how does that translate economically? We don't really get the economic cost of breaches. I remember when it was Target and Home Depot that we were talking about, some of the speculation with these big data breaches was that the punitive measures would come through stock price or customer loyalty, but we haven't seen any evidence of that. So I think one of the first things is really doing a holistic understanding of what these breaches mean, what they cost, what do they cost individuals, what do they cost our economy, what are the national security implications, and then only then can we really have a good discussion about what the remunerations would be.
Well, I mean, Senator Leahy brought up his piece of legislation, the Consumer Privacy Protection Act. Do I have that right? It's amazing that I remember that. Anyway, I'm a co-sponsor, but I can't ever remember the name of things. Anyway, I mean, do you know that piece of legislation, and would that be helpful, do you think?
I think, as I understand it, it's a nationwide data breach notification requirement is what the heart of it, and I think that is a useful start. I think that we have state-level data breach notifications, so this is why we now know so much about breaches of personal information. I think where we can improve efforts like that is by being more specific about the kinds of harms that we want reporting on. So we should consider expanding reportable events beyond just a breach of personal information to financial fraud affecting victims, for example, and the other harms that I alluded to. So I think if we
who would know about the financial fraud that happens to somebody?
Well, financial institutions would eventually learn. The consumers would eventually experience it, and so would the credit bureaus.
I think that's a good start. I think it would be interesting to look at a model where consumers can opt in and out. I would prefer that they not use my data. So I don't think they've been good stewards. I think a lot of people feel that same way. So if we look at the model where people can say, yes, you know, I want my credit history taken care of by certain agencies and not others, that could be an incentive. Because without any data, they can't do the data analytics that feeds the 90% of the business that you mentioned.
And if I could carry on with, jump onto that, I think one of the things I mentioned in my testimony, I'll reiterate here, I think that if we were to place the burden on the bureaus to freeze by default, I think that this could quite elegantly incentivize companies to come up with better, stronger ways of authentication and authenticating easily.
What does that mean, freeze by default?
Well, so what it would mean is that with the a system where you put a freeze in place, right now consumers may be given the option to do that, but you have to take the initiative to go and freeze your credit. So I have my credit frozen, but I had to go to 3 websites, sign up, and fill all this information out, and then it's frozen. So that is not by default. By default, it's still wide open. So the way it exists today is for the 145 million Americans whose information has been breached. If a criminal wants to get new credit in their name, they can just go and do it. But if you had a default in place where by default it's locked down, then they would be prevented from doing so, and unless the consumer can be authenticated and to say, no, I actually want to unlock my report.
Okay, and presumably do they know who the 145 million people are? Does Equifax know? I mean, how did they come up with that number? And do they come up with that number because they know who those people are?
They should know, yes.
They do know.
They have a very large database table, from what I can tell, that had people's information that was
so they
accessed.
could they have proactively just said, you know, hey, Tyler Moore of wherever you live, and you don't have to say that right now, because then it would be out there, and who knows what could happen. But and that's not a threat. What I'm saying is, why couldn't they just have contacted everybody that had been breached?
Well, they certainly can, and they certainly have tried to issue notifications in certain states that are required to, is my understanding.
They didn't.
But
ones
they could send a letter, right? But sending a letter is not the same thing as putting a freeze on your credit, right? And
right.
Putting a freeze on your credit would gum up the works in their current business model, I would think.
But I have a question about, do they know? So when I wrote my initial testimony, it was 103 million, or 143 million, and then had to revise that to 145.5 million. Yahoo just revised their breach from 1 billion to 3 billion people. So they certainly know who has been breached, but they may not know the full extent of that breach. And that to me is concerning.
Okay, well, just curiously, since we can't get this information from them, what is their other business model? What is the 90% that isn't, or what percent is, because we kept asking them, our office, and they would not, you had the same experience, which frankly, to me, is, I think, bad, some notion of bad actor there, my feeling.
I mean, my understanding, as I'm not an expert in their particular business model, is it has to do with, if business of other acquiring banks who want to say issue, or issuers who want to issue new credit cards would then pull and query the credit files, or telecommunications companies, you go to get a new contract on your cell phone, they would then do a credit pull, this kind of thing. My understanding is that would be a more business-to-business relationship, because the credit bureau would have a relationship with, say, the telecommunications company. And so it's examples like that.
Can they do something to do analytics for advertising and that kind of thing with their data?
I'm sure they have the capacity. I'm not sure if they do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess we'll never know.
Well,
It's unknowable, evidently. Could they have given these analytics to the Russians, who could have put ads targeted toward Michigan and Wisconsin? And can we blame Mr. Smith on the whole Russian thing?
I'll let you decide if you want to blame Mr. Smith on the Russian thing. What I can say is, when you don't protect data, you don't have control over who uses it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to leave data stores basically unprotected, then you don't get a say.
Well, that's
how
if
those
it's
get
breached,
used.
but I mean, they do have business using the data they have.
Sure.
And
Could they have purposefully used it?
That's what I'm saying.
Well, they are. This steps away from the Russia question, but they are under current FTC decree for selling lists of data, people who were late on their mortgages.
Mm-hmm.
So they have had that as part of their business in the past.
Okay, well, that seems like a financial business-to-business thing, but I'm talking about, we've got all this data, and you want to target people who have this, and this for advertising.
I think it would depend on the vetting process and deciding who they want their clients to be.
Okay.
I found it interesting that both of you, in your written testimony, and then Ms. Winterton, in your oral testimony, talked about the concern about marrying this information with OPM's information. Mr. Moore, do you want to comment any more on that? Have we seen examples of that in the past of in any of the forensic information that we now have of other companies doing that?
I mean, in this case,
or other hackers.
In this case, we don't know. It's too soon to tell. But at this point, we don't know who the perpetrators of the acts were. But I mean, it's certainly plausible that cyber criminals themselves could become sort of illicit data brokers, compromising large, different data sets and then joining them up themselves. So it's certainly within the realm of possibility, and frankly, not that complicated, I wouldn't expect, if they so wanted to do.
Ask one last question, is the national security implications. How can this data be used by a foreign power? And speaking of the OPM.
Yeah.
Sure. In order to get a security clearance, you need to prove that you've got good credit. And that's because people who have financial troubles have vulnerabilities. So, but a lot can happen in between the time that you apply for your clearance and receive that clearance and the time when it's re-upped, so to speak. So if a foreign adversary were to know that a person had a security clearance and therefore access to sensitive data, and that they were in some kind of a financial trouble, that leaves that person vulnerable to some kind of bribery, to blackmail, exchange for, if you give us that security information, we can make some of these financial problems go away. That's one of my concerns.
And to add to that, another possible concern could arise from the ability to gain information to conduct further surveillance, right? So if you know where targets live, if you know where from the OPM breach who has a security clearance, and then if you can know for that person where they bank, where they live, that would provide ready information for further targeting, I would expect.
Okay.
Mr. Moore, you discussed societal harms by these large-scale data breaches, not only to individual consumers, but to the economy as a whole. How do consumers' habits change after a breach, and how might that affect the economy generally?
Well, I mean, I think they're sort of the direct potential harms, that people might have less access to credit because they've wrongfully had their credit score degraded. That's one possibility. But what I worry about more is sort of these indirect costs where people overcorrect and sort of withdraw from the economy as a result. So, and maybe take steps that are not effective. So when I was going to the airport yesterday, I talked to my Uber driver about what I was doing. And he said that since the Equifax breach, he was afraid to anymore back up his personal data off of his phone, his smartphone, out to the cloud, because it might have sensitive information. And so that's concerning to me when I hear statements like that, because in fact, he should be backing up his data, because there is a very real risk that he might lose his phone and that would cause him harms. But he's taking a step, which is to try to in reaction to this breach, which could actually harm him in the long run. So that's an example of an indirect cost that I worry about. And in the aggregate, this could actually be quite problematic.
Well, thank you. You have anything further?
Mr. Chairman, I ask consent that letters from advocacy organizations, public knowledge, and the Electronic Privacy Information Center be entered into the record.
Without objection. And we've also received letters from outside groups who've asked that their statements be part of the record as well. Without objection, we'll add those as well. Thank you for your testimony here today, and thank you for not answering his questions on where you live. If he asks for your mother's maiden name or your first pet, then that's usually
a bad tell.
Usually he's fishing. So
I was going to ask for the mother's maiden name, but
anyway,
that's handy.
I appreciate it. Combined with the hearing that, as mentioned, we had a couple of years ago, and these two panels today, this gives us information that is useful as we try to craft legislation to deal with this. So thank you much for your testimony. And
thank you both.
With that,
thank you.
Hearing is adjourned. Or your